My name is Sam Bardaouil. I'm the co-director of Hamburger Bahnhof, and we're very, very happy to see all of you here today. I think the sun is competing with us, so to see that many people here is really, really great. But I don't think it has anything to do with me, but it has everything to do with the fact that we have a wonderful artist with us today, Rachel Whiteread, who took the train specifically from Denmark to be with us here today. So we're very, very grateful. This is the second in a series of talks in conversation that we launched last month. It happens every Saturday, every first Saturday of every month, and it's supported by Deutsche Bank, Art and Culture. We started the first one with Tanya Bruguera, and I was thinking, Tanya is a troublemaker, wink, wink. So, will we have as many people today? But clearly, it is remarkable to see all of you and all the messages that we've been getting, Rachel, in the last couple of weeks of Rachel Whiteread is coming back to Berlin. We're super, super excited, and she's our idol, whether it's younger artists or people, curators, institutional colleagues. Everybody's excited to have you with us here. We'll try to keep it as informal as possible. Neither of us is a very, very formal type of person, I would say. No. And I will start actually by just showing you something which is usually hanging in our forum space. I don't know if you can all see this. Rachel, I don't know if you remember this. Back in 1997, there was an exhibition that took place in London called Sensation, and it was a presentation of the collection, the Saatchi collection in London, of a generation of young British artists, or a loosely affiliated group of artists that became known as the Young British Artists, the YBA group. And that exhibition actually started off in London to a big hoorah, and we can talk about this a little later. And then it came to Hamburger Bahnhof, and it was on display here at the end of 1997, 98, 99. So the show was in 98, apologies, and then it came later in the year, and it was here on view from late 98, 97. And of course, Rachel's work was in this exhibition, and we'll talk about this also in a little bit later. So I think we're not doing very well if it took us that many years to get you back to sit here and talk. So this is something that I feel very, very embarrassed about, and I'm glad that we could fix it today by having you back. But this is just to show that Rachel has a very, very long history and involvement with Hamburger Bahnhof. Actually, you were telling me you were in another show, perhaps a few years later.
Yeah, I thought it was a few years earlier, but I maybe I can't quite remember. I'm getting old, and a long career.
It's clear that, well, Hamburger Bahnhof was a Kunsthalle of sorts before it opened in 1996 as the National Gallery of Contemporary Art. So there were many exhibitions happening here, and perhaps it was one of those shows. So even before Hamburger Bahnhof opened officially. And clearly at the moment, and this is the first image that we're starting with, and I will let Rachel take it from there. It's going to be more of an informal presentation with me interjecting with some questions. This work by Rachel is actually on display now in our collection presentation in the West Wing. So if you have not had the chance to see it, I strongly recommend that after the talk, you go and visit the collection presentation and you see Rachel's work. So Rachel, this was from the time when you were here in Berlin.
Yeah, I mean, when I lived in London, I came here 92, I was here for 18 months, I think, 92, kind of 93. And I made a lot of work in series, and I was working on this series, working with beds, and I think I made maybe 5 or 6 pieces here in Berlin. I mean, the great delight for me when I came here was, I was talking earlier about how it was at a period where I was still having to work, and I worked at various jobs 2 or 3 days a week, teaching and doing other things, working in TV. This period was the first time I was really able to concentrate on making my work. I had a grant, I had a great studio, I had a wonderful apartment, and in the apartment I was able to have another studio which was a drawing studio, which is a practice that I've kept right the way through. So I have a kind of quiet space and a sort of constructing space. So it was really during that time, and I was experimenting a lot with materials, and I was using a lot of rubber, a lot of sort of industrial type materials, plaster, mainly actually plaster and rubber at that point.
And this is one of those works that you actually created while you were here in Berlin, or maybe just before or during?
No, I think it was when I was here, and they were constructed from beds. I would buy sort of second-hand beds and then re-stretch the fabric underneath. So it was like a sort of canvas. And then I would put in sort of rubber and a core of some other kind of neoprene material, and then pour around it. So they were always cast flat, and then they would take on this shape by putting a kind of wedge underneath it, or, doing something with it. And I very much saw these, they're the most sort of anthropomorphic pieces that I made. They were as close to making a human figure as I've ever got, really.
Yeah, I must say what I like about the work a lot is the sense of movement. You feel that somebody could have been lying on it just a few seconds ago and left, and it's not lying completely flat. It could be lifted and it could be moved. And maybe here I would like to ask you a little bit about your impression of Berlin at the time, because the way we are showing the work in the collection is in a section that talks about that moment of transition in Berlin, the early 90s, right after the opening of the Berlin Wall. Many people asking, what does it mean to live in a city that's changing so fast? The space between the domestic and the collective, the private. A mattress is a place you belong. What were your impressions, and how did Berlin at the time maybe impact your thinking about your work, materiality, but also bigger concept?
Yeah, I mean, I have a few slides, a few images here of the Berlin that I knew. So in 1992, the wall had been down for 2 years.
Less than 3 years.
Yeah. And it was very much a place that was a divided place. There was a big sort of scar in the center of the city where nobody really went. It was, you'd occasionally have a circus there or something, but it was a kind of no man's land, and it was very kind of grey, and there wasn't a lot of love there. There was, I lived in Charlottenburg. You're very lucky to live in such a lovely area. But it certainly wasn't like that all over Berlin. And it felt really very kind of neglected. And, the museums were, kind of neglected. I mean, it felt unloved. And when I went there, and I was very much, I didn't know what I wanted from my experience here, but I knew that there was obviously an enormous amount of history, and I would go around looking for traces. And, as I do in London, where you'd go on the outside of the Tate Gallery, for example, there'd be, great big shell marks or, things that were in the fabric of the city. And so this was actually the only indication of anything kind of Nazi that I found here, which was this little tiny swastika which had been covered up, and then someone had kind of broken it out. And this is up at the Olympic Stadium. And there were, the Brandenburg Gate. I went and looked at a number of concentration camps. I went to the East quite a lot because I was obviously familiar with the kind of Western civilization and Western Europe. But it was very interesting to go to the East, where the choices were so different. The landscape was so different. The shops were different. It felt a very, very particularly sort of strange place. I would go and follow the line of the wall around East. But so we went on sort of expeditions, and they weren't your sort of usual going to, I mean, Potsdam, we did go to Potsdam, but it wasn't that kind of thing we were looking for. It was more the sort of traces and the feel of Berlin. I came here with my now husband, and we had a really great sort of 18 months here, really eye-opening and a kind of wonderful place to sort of spend some time, have some money, have time to really work and absorb a place that wasn't sort of at its best. You know, it was a sort of humbled city at the time.
You know, there's this thing about Berlin. I'm not a Berliner, and I've moved here to actually work at Hamburger Bahnhof, but I've been coming to Berlin, of course, for many years. And there's this thing about Berlin where the moment you meet someone, the first thing they say, oh, you just missed it. Like it's always been better just a few years ago. And I don't know if there's ever a moment where Berlin is sufficiently loved or sufficiently hated. It's a city that's constantly teetering on, you feel things could go in any direction. And maybe this is why it's a city that vibrates with a lot of possibilities for artists who come here.
Yes, I think it's exactly that. I mean, I know a lot of artists that have come here, and you know, and they were here in the very early 90s, and they bought, say, a building very cheaply, turned it into studios, and have made it their home, have been able to live here and make a kind of income like that. Or, you know, when I was here, as I said, you know, there was a Alexanderplatz, and around the center of Berlin was very neglected, and within 5 years, it was a completely changed place. Hundreds of architects moved here, and they all, you know, built hotels and offices and the Reichstag, and, you know.
I mean, I think you're describing our neighborhood pretty well, because this is exactly what happened around Hamburger Bahnhof. You know, the wall used to be right by here, by the canal cutting through Invalidenstraße. Actually, one of the very first people to be shot when they were trying to escape from the east to the west also took place here on the canal. And now you look and you see all the developments with the real estate developments, the hotels, the Europa City, the residential area. So what does that mean, neighborhoods and the changes of the city? And maybe this is a good moment to go into what we're seeing on the slide, because ultimately your work in many ways deals with this notion of the domestic, of the spaces that are not so visible, that you try to make visible, which are part of our living environments, yet we don't actually see them so much.
I mean, I think just going back to that about Berlin, I think one of the interesting things about it was because it was a divided city, it became like lots of villages on either side of the wall, and then trying to combine that once the wall came down, and sort of trying to make, you know, you can't force a center of a city. You know, a city grows naturally from the center outwards, and if it doesn't have a center, then everything's kind of grows inwards, and it's a funny way round. It makes for a funny sort of placement of buildings and neighborhoods, as you say. But it was something very much that I was interested in, and I was interested in working with the domestic. And I had, when I first left college, I was given the opportunity to have an exhibition, and in this exhibition I showed 4 works, and these are the 4 works. They're called Shallow Breath, which is the bed against the wall, Mantle, which is the dressing table, Closet, which is the black box, and then Torso, which is the hot water bottle. And these were the elements of sort of recent history, where after the war in the UK and everywhere really, there was this very cheap utilitarian furniture made, which my grandparents had, my parents had, and I had when I first went to college. It was the thing that sort of furnished all these small student houses, and I wanted to kind of memorialize these sort of forgotten, uninteresting pieces of furniture like they were small buildings. And closet, which is the black one, came from a childhood experience, trying to make a childhood experience very concrete, which was hiding in the wardrobe, yeah, and then trying to sort of reproduce this black space by covering it in black felt, which is a very sort of light, absorbent material, so it sort of sucks all the light out of it. So these were the four very early works that I made that I think when this work was first seen, people sort of recognized that maybe there was something within this work that was really going to sort of resonate, and there became, there was interest in what I did. Now this is some images of me casting Ghost, which is the next slide. But just to show you my sort of approach at that time, a lot of the work that I made on my own, and this piece in particular was quite sort of taxing thing to make on my own. It was made in plaster. I worked inside this room, made a kind of drawing, mapped it out, went inside with buckets of plaster, and gradually over a period of about 3 months, put this together, and very occasionally had help from Marcus, my husband, but generally kind of made the whole thing. And so all of these works were very much based on my own size and scale and what I could lift and move.
So in a sense, just to kind of maybe give some background information, I think, if I'm not mistaken, this was a house on Archway Road in North London, and they were widening the road, and the building was kind of almost chopped in half.
No, the buildings on this road were going to be dismantled and demolished, but actually they weren't demolished in the end. But it was, I just had a group called Acme Studios owned these houses, and they just said, oh, you can use this to cast, and
Yeah. And this work probably was a very important turning point, because it's led to some of the larger scale works. Specifically, maybe we can talk about a very important work called House.
Yes,
which is exactly 1993. And that was historical on many levels, because it was the first time that a woman artist wins the Turner Prize. And it was also the year where you got the K Foundation Art Award, which is supposed to be for the worst artist. I think it's great. It only adds to your glory that in the same year you get the Turner Prize and then you get the K, because it was controversial. It was a woman working with sculpture of the scale in the public domain. Maybe you can tell us more about this, and it's very, very unique.
I mean, the piece was called House, and it's actually when I was living here, we were working on it, so I would have to go backwards and forwards a little bit, and we were trying to find a house which had to be a building that was going to be demolished. I didn't want to make a sculpture from a building that could be lived in. So eventually we found this house, and I think we had a year that we were going to be allowed to sort of use this. And we worked on it, solidly, and made this concrete sculpture where every single sort of inch of the building was cast in concrete, and then the building was taken apart brick by brick, and we were left with this. And it was in the middle of the street, in East London, in between what was the sort of financial district and the sort of domestic area in the East End. And it was the area that was, we had a prime minister a little earlier than this called Margaret Thatcher, and it was her sort of capitalist dream to have this corridor of wealth. And then I put this up as a little kind of disruptor in the middle of it. And it got an enormous amount of attention. And when we were making it, it obviously took longer to make than we thought. And we only had a sort of shortish period that we were actually allowed to show it before it was demolished. But this sculpture, you know, it was the first time something like this had caused such a controversy, as you know.
Were you aware of the connotations of the work, the political criticism that it entails, or were you mostly thinking about form and material, or both?
No, I was completely aware of it. I knew that it was something that was going to cause a discussion, and there were acts in Parliament read about it where people were trying to get it to stay up. But there was one particular man who, in the local council, who wanted it removed, and he won in the end. So it was only up, I think, for about 2.5 months in the end.
Well, I think that's also the very powerful element in this kind of practice, that the work remains and the conversation that happens around it sometimes becomes more important in terms of its agency and as a platform to instigate certain consciousness, perception, change.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think if it had longevity, I don't know if it would have been so powerful. I think partly partly its power was that it was there and then it was gone, you know. And so many people say, "Oh, I saw your house," and then they say, "Actually, I don't know if I did. I thought I did," and they kind of remember, because they remember the story. It's a bit like being a child and having a childhood memory, but it comes from a photograph, you know. Anyway, so I kind of made this piece. It had a life. People responded to it. But, you know, as I was talking about during my time in Berlin, and I had this experience, and I'm a kind of emotional sponge, and I talked a lot to people, to individuals whose parents might have had a connection with the Holocaust or whatever. Because I was interested, I wasn't trying to upset anyone, but I was just interested in what it was like for a place, a country, to sort of live with such a kind of recent trauma, because really it had only been, you know, 20, 30 years before. You know, so for me it was a kind of interesting point for people to be able to discuss, you know, how their grandparents would have been, you know, part of this discussion. So anyway, when I moved back to London and I was asked to put in a proposal for a piece in Vienna for a Holocaust memorial, I decided to try and make something because of the experience that I'd had here. And my parents, they also had four very good friends that were Jewish and that had lived in Berlin and somewhere, I think, Munich. And so I'd had this sort of experience of kind of fed memory, and I felt somehow I might be able to do something on this place called Judenplatz. I then spent 5 years trying to make this piece.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to say two things. You know, something very interesting about this commission is that, relatively speaking, you had graduated in 1987.
Yeah.
You were at the beginning of your career, and there was this call for this very important gravitas. You know, this is not just any commission in a private setting. It's the Judenplatz, commemorating the Holocaust. And if I dug a little bit and did some research, and, you know, other contenders were Ilya Kabakov, Valley Export, Heimut Zobering, and then this young artist from the UK who had been doing a residency in Berlin is awarded this very, very important project, which was supposed to happen in '96, but then there were a lot of excavations underneath and it didn't open until 2000. What was it like to be awarded, and how did you feel when you knew that you were given such a very important and visible commission about a history that is not particularly your own? Like we always ask these days, do I have the right to talk or to represent or speak about somebody else's experience when it's not my own? And I think this is a challenge for many of us curators, artists today. How did you negotiate that distance and felt that you could contribute something? You started talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I started talking about my experiences here and my experiences as a child. You know, I suppose as a kid whose parents, whose grandparents were involved in the war in my family, one was fought in the war and the other one was a conscientious objector. My parents were very political, so it was something that was always around, that was always discussed and thought about. When I was given the commission, I was absolutely horrified and slightly terrified, because I'd gone along to this, what they call a jury, which as an artist is something that architects do all the time. They go to juries and they're like competitions and you speak. As an artist, you don't do that. You know, you're never put in a place where you've got 10 people firing questions at you. And I knew very well what I was making, and I knew how impenetrable it was, and I knew that it was saying something, and that the books were
yeah, maybe you walk us a little bit through the work
yeah,
itself.
I mean, the piece itself, it had 2 doors at the front, which you couldn't open, but they had door handles, so there were little kind of holes that you could kind of put your finger into, but it went nowhere. The outside of the piece was completely covered in books, but the books had the spine of the book was on the inside, so you couldn't see it. All you could see was sort of leaves to books. On the ceiling of the room, there was a ceiling rose with a sort of funnel running through it, which was the drainage, and I always sort of thought of it as the sort of tiers. And around the base, it has all of the names of the concentration camps, and I think how many people died in them. And it was a piece that some people obviously really responded to and loved, and there were other people that really weren't so sure. One of the people on the panel was someone called Simon Wiesenthal, who's a very famous Nazi hunter, and he spent his entire life tracking down Nazis, and he was not in favor of the work because he wanted a figurative piece that.
I think he said something that the work should hurt, it shouldn't be beautiful.
Yeah. But he was told by a publisher, actually a guy called Lord Wiedenfeld, but you know, I think she might be Jewish she's got a good Jewish name, Rachel, you know, and so he was basically sort of told that I was Jewish, and he when I was told to go and be given this award, he had his arm around me and was very proud of his young Jewess about to make this sculpture, until he was told, or rather all of the journalists were saying to me, "Are you Jewish? Are you Jewish?" And I had to say no. And his arm fell away from my shoulder and he never spoke to me again for 5 years. So.
But I think this is where an artwork becomes also a bigger entry into these very, very important questions. I mean, clearly we are living through a very difficult moment now, and all of us have questions, all of us have opinions. How can an artist navigate these situations? Is an artist supposed to represent every story and every experience. It's not even possible for an individual or an institution to do that. And I think the work itself and many other works that are burdened in a sense with this responsibility of representation to become a symbol of, to a certain extent, are impossible projects because they can succeed in certain ways, but they can also fail in certain ways. And maybe this is a jarring reminder of what art can do. Maybe, as you said, it's about the conversation and the questions that it raises, and not about it being able to be a vessel that can include every single experience and every single story, but bring people around it to talk about these situations and open up to certain issues that might be theirs, that might be somebody else's.
I mean, you know, the interesting thing about trying to make this was that during the time, in the 5 years that we tried to make it happen, I think there were 3 changes of government, really swinging from the left to the really far right. You know, Vienna at the time was really quite sort of fascistic. A lot of it was hidden, but it was gradually really coming to the surface. And it was quite an uncomfortable place. And people decided that they didn't want the memorial there. They wanted it moved to another place that wasn't as yes, exactly. So it was more in a place where there were lots of other sculptures, you know, of you know, shiny generals that no one knew their names. But I refused and said, if you're going to move it, then you have to do the whole competition again, and I won't be a part of it.
There's something about the work, and maybe this takes me to back to Hamburger Bahnhof a little bit. There's something about your work, Rachel, that I find extremely important, and maybe we can talk about it a little, is that while the context and the references might be extremely different from talking about, I don't know, real estate change, capitalism, in this case, the commemoration of a very dark moment in European world history, you also have a certain commitment, or at least there's a long period in your practice where you're committed to this exploration of space, the negative versus the positive space. And in 1997, 1998, when the Sensation exhibition was on, and then it came to Hamburger Bahnhof, you created a very, very special work. The work was actually, I'm just trying to find my notes, 100 spaces, exactly. And it was the negative space underneath 100 chairs, and it was laid out in a grid in the space. I think it was 10 rows of 10 negative spaces underneath chairs. You were referencing perhaps or dialoguing to a certain extent to a very important work from the late 60s by Bruce Nauman, where he did a cement cast of the negative space underneath his chair. But this was happening at as part of this young British artist frenzy, the show that opened at the RCA, then the Sensation show at the Saatchi space, where you had people like Jake and Dinas Chapman with mannequins of children where the noses were replaced by penises and the mouths were replaced by anuses. And you had Tracy Emin's tent with all the men she had slept with. You had, I don't know, the shark, the very famous or infamous shark of Damien Hirst, the impossibility of death, frozen formaldehyde, cut in half. And there you are, presenting a work that one could see first and foremost as very much involved in the form, in the materiality, in space, echoing minimalism, dialoguing with art historical styles. How did you feel? Did you feel that your work was hijacked in a sense, or overshadowed by so much talk about sensationalism? Or do you feel your work...
I mean, I never felt overshadowed. I mean, I was always, I think, luckily, actually, a little different from the rest of the YBAs, some of which are very famous now, a lot of which have kind of disappeared. And there was a lot of shouting and a lot of look at me, and it was very much, it was like a kind of art circus. And there were some very interesting artists there. but what I was doing, I was on a sort of personal quest, I suppose, and the things that I'd always been interested in, were mainly 60s minimalism. I've always been interested in architecture. I'd always been interested in form, and this is 20 pieces long and 5 meters wide, 5 pieces wide. And the material was 3 different types of resin, and I think 4 different types of the medium which cures the resin, and that meant that there was lots of color change. It was pieces that you could sort of look at, you could also look into. They had a sort of feeling of whereas a lot of the plaster pieces that I'd made were, you just really see the exterior. This, you could also see the interior, and the light always made the piece come alive from the inside. So, that period of time, I mean, there were lots of shows where all the YBA showed together, and we were like, a bit like the Spice Girls, we'd go around Europe showing in various venues. And
it was a trend to do these group shows that would represent a city or represent a culture, or Indonesia now, or Chinese contemporary art, the young British artists. It seems like ages ago.
We would go to these cities and get drunk and cause mayhem and leave our
Well, the
work
exhibition
up.
was so successful here that it was actually extended by a couple of months. I think the dates were on the poster did not relate to the reality of the show. But perhaps going back to your work, what I find very interesting about this work is that it opens up 2 other very important elements in your practice, which is not only working with cement or plaster, like opaque materials, but resin and translucent, transparent, which comes up, for instance, in 2001 in your Trafalgar Square full length, but also color. Maybe we can talk a little bit about color and translucency, or the materiality in your work, the different...
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd always worked with sort of form and texture and, to an extent, color, but it wasn't really, I always used to set myself rules, which I've kind of grown out of now, but, that I couldn't put pigment in something. It had to come from the material. And it's quite nice working with rules, because it gives you limitations, gives you, rather than having endless ways of doing something, it sort of breaks it down. I think really partly the sort of frustration of making things that weren't, a lot of the information was on the surface, and it was the light that sort of brought these things to life. And with this, similar thing, but the light really brought it to light. It would brought it to life. It would really, you'd have coloured shadows. It would be, a very different kind of feeling altogether.
I guess the Trafalgar Square Commission was one of those works where you used this resin, and then you did a very beautiful project in New York as part of a public art commission, which was in Soho, one of those water tanks, which was then acquired by MoMA.
Yeah, now lives on the roof of MoMA, one of the wooden water tanks. I was looking, after making House and all of the sort of hoo-ha that went around House, when I was asked to do something in New York, and I was given all these sites to think about, and they were all, very prominent sites on the sort of ground level. And I just thought, I really don't want to make something that's going to cause that kind of stink again. I just want to do something quiet. So I started to look up and saw the water towers, which are, they're almost like the furniture of New York. And I used one of those and cast that, But after, a lot of this sort of, the sort of excess of attention, I suppose. One of the things I decided to do was make works which I call shy sculptures, and I've made probably about 10 or 12 now, and they're different places around the world. There's a couple in the UK, there's 2 in the desert in California and Joshua Tree, there's one in Japan, there's one in Norway, and they're pieces that I make that are using sort of generic buildings that so this one, for example, is a sort of shepherd's hut, a hut that is used on an estate in a big house where the people that work on the land would use them for helping animals give birth, for pheasant shoots, for all of those sort of things that were sort of part of the community of this sort of country home. The next one is one of what's called a shotgun shack, which is in the desert in California. This one is in New York, and it's right by it was on a place called Governor's Island, which looks onto the site of where the World Trade Center was. And because I'd been an artist that people had recognized could work with trauma, that I was asked at the time when 9/11 happened if I would think about making a memorial, and I said, absolutely no. This has to settle. It has to be understood. You can't react immediately to something that is so traumatic. Anyway, about 5-10 years later, I was asked again if I would do something on this place, on this island. So I went out there and just saw the place that would be perfect, where on the left-hand side, there's the Statue of Liberty, and on the right-hand side, when you're looking out, is the former site of 9/11. And I made this small building, which looked like a kind of building that a small person that lived out of society, that maybe practiced things which weren't quite so wholesome. I kind of thought about the Unabomber and someone like that. Anyway, I made this piece, and it sort of lives there now. It also has a lot of bronze sort of detritus, which is cast and left in little piles around the building. This piece is very large, and it's a building that they were used a lot during the war, and they were used for all sorts of reasons. They'd be used as for places for people to sleep, they'd be to store things. They were very quick buildings that you could just put up. You put a brick wall up at either end, and then put these corrugated structures over the top.
So why do you call them shy sculptures?
Because they're all in very difficult places to find, difficult to get to. They're not in a street where everybody can just go and, you have to go on a journey. And I haven't, I will do, but I still haven't got round to it. I need to make a book or a publication or something online which really explains where these are. I need to do a website, and
if we have any designers here, this could be a good moment to come and talk to Rachel.
So yes, I do need to make something. I've always loved Robert Smithson's work, and I love the way the spiral jetty just kind of disappears and comes back, and it has a kind of life of its own. And these pieces, even though they're mainly in kind of public spaces, they're all you know, in the middle of Yorkshire somewhere in the countryside, or, you know, on an island, or in the middle of the desert. And, you know, they're not things that you just come across.
So I'm just conscious about time, and I wanted to perhaps move the conversation a little bit forward to 2021 and talk a little bit about one of those also pivotal moments in your practice, when you were working on a new body of work for one of your exhibitions with your gallery, with Gagosian. You did two works, two large-scale sculptures that were done, I think, around that time, Doppelganger and Poltergeist. And these two sculptures mark a very different approach, departure. And you yourself, when you talk about it, you say that this was, you were anxious about that and wondered how your people that follow your work, you know, would receive them. Maybe you can talk to us about what was going on, what led to that, and then as we look at some of these images.
So during COVID, I mean, I know we all had our own experiences of COVID. You know, as an artist, and I know I could speak for lots of other artists as well, it was a kind of great time in lots of ways, because it meant you could really just concentrate. And I was doing a show in about 18 months' time for Gagosian Gallery in London, and I knew that I wanted to stir things up a bit. I knew that I wanted to change a little bit the way I worked. And so the first piece, this is Poltergeist. And I'm a great sort of hoarder and collector of materials, things that I don't really know if I'll use them or what's going to happen to them. But I'll, you know, my studio is always just full of pieces of junk, you know, that I decide whether or not they can become something. But what I started doing, and I didn't really know why, was I started painting these sticks. And these two sticks were about 2 meters long, and they were kind of like bones. And I had them in the studio, and I just painted them and painted them and painted them, and they probably have like 10, 12 layers of paint on them. And they really became almost like the sort of positive of themselves, if that's a way of describing something. And I had the same thing with corrugated iron, and a lot of this corrugated iron had rusted so much it was almost like lace, and I kind of stopped it from rusting, and then just started painting it and painting it and painting it, and sort of making this material that I could never really have made by casting it. It was really that the paint still felt quite like plaster. It was very chalky white paint that I was using. Anyway, it kind of brought this thing back to life and became this structure that was, and it was a little bit like Ghost, and it had, you know, hence it's called Poltergeist, but it felt as if something had sort of exploded from the inside of the small building that I'd made. But it was a funny time, and it is always strange to sort of change direction. And, you know, I'd always cast things, I'd always made molds, I'd always worked with materials in a very particular kind of way, and I'd you know, fundamentally changed that practice. So it was an interesting departure for me.
I think maybe also as a side note, it's important to say that we focused mostly in the talk on the large-scale sculptural works, but there's a beautiful other line in your work that is on a much smaller scale, whether it's two-dimensional surfaces, works that hang on walls, I mean, in this exhibition, there were beautiful pieces like the pinboard, like crinkle, crankle, snow, yellow. What's the difference for you, maybe just to share a little bit with our audience today, when you work on a large scale and when you're working exactly on a much smaller scale? It's a very different muscle activity. It's a very different relation to the body itself. When do you decide that for you it's important to go into the intimate smaller, and when is it important for you to go? What's happening in your head as you kind of...
Well, I'll tend to work on three things at once. I tend to have drawings on the go, which I would call this a drawing. It's about 1 meter by 2 meters, something like that. And it's cast in papier-mâché. And the papier-mâché is all of the paper rubbish from my studio, so everything gets shredded and I turn it into paper and cast with it, and then do these silver leaf drawings on it. And then there'll be something like this, which is in bronze, which are sort of packets from packaging, and then I would patinate and paint the bronze. I've always done a lot of drawing. So all of these things are part of my practice. There are resin works that I make that go on the wall, which come from sort of windows and pin boards and, all sorts of things.
A whole range of materiality, whether it's celluloid, graphite, cardboard, silver leaf, and they all come together, and somehow you stop being able, having seen some of these works in some of your exhibitions, you can't tell anymore where one material ends and the other one begins. It's kind of a sculptural collage that meets a painting.
Yeah, I think, a lot of people might go to a show of mine and initially think it was 5 different artists, but, someone said to me, somehow there's always the same touch. You have the same touch with materials and a sort of sensitivity or sensibility with the way in which I make objects that somehow, looks like me. The final piece, because I think we're running out of time, is a piece which was made in Bergamo last summer in Italy. And Bergamo was where COVID first hit Europe and was completely sort of decimated by this virus. The place it was shown in was a place called the Palazzo della Ragione, and the title and the animals were sold. It sort of alludes to the markets in China and where the virus may have started, but also this place was originally a kind of marketplace and a place for civic councils and things to meet in the city and discuss things like weights and measures and all of the kind of legalities of trading in the sort of 16th, 15th century. So it has these beautiful frescoes on the walls. There's a beautiful terracotta floor. And when I was given the kind of commission, they didn't ask me to make a memorial, but for me it felt like the place to do it, as it was the first place I traveled after COVID. If people remember, we couldn't really go anywhere for 2 years, and it felt for someone like me who's, I travel regularly for my work, it was kind of a rest, but it was also interesting to start traveling again and be really treated like an alien, and going to this place. And I'm very familiar with Italy, normally very loving, kind people that want to sort of welcome guests and tourists. But there was a very strange feeling that we were aliens and that we kind of were unclean and we weren't really appreciated. So anyway, I decided to make this memorial. So it's something that I find very touching because the whole city got behind it, and once they knew what I was doing, they raised more money to have it made. They got the people that ran the quarries to donate. They got people to help in the making of the works, and it was really something that was used as a sort of healing place. It was on for about 4 or 5 months, and it was used incredibly well. Initially, they were going to have it as a kind of hall where other things happened, but they decided to keep it as just this very quiet, sort of meditative place where people could just come and sort of pay their respects to their loved ones and for those that were bereaved. And so
Beautifully installed, and of course the dialogue with the setting and the historical works is very, very touching. Perhaps on this note we can bring the conversation to open up to our guests and see the kind of questions or larger conversations that we can have. Before we do this, just one last thing from my end. And this is something that maybe is the first question to open up the questions from an institutional perspective. I remember that there was an interview that you did with The Guardian in 2023 when you were talking about the commission for the fourth plinth on Trafalgar Square. And if for those of us who don't know what this is, there's an annual, I think it's annual or biannual, it's annual, public commission where an artist is asked to create a sculpture that is placed on one of the empty plinths. There are 4 columns on Trafalgar Square in London, and Rachel did it in 2001. And you were asked about this in a conversation, and you said that most of the works, except one of these sculptures, is sitting somewhere in storage. And maybe this project needs to be rethought. What do we do with all these sculptures, all this production, especially when it's of a certain scale, of a certain size? And this is something we're asking ourselves a lot as an institution when it comes to sustainability, to climate change. You put a lot of things in depots and you have to maintain them in perfect humidity, perfect temperature. And it's really a major polluter. Forget exhibition design and exhibition making. And I know this is a topic that's very close to your heart because you're a patron of the Environmental Justice Foundation. So what is your take on this for us as museums, as hoarders who keep on collecting and acquiring and storing? And what's the future of a practice like yours, Rachel? How do you, I mean, on one hand...
Wow, what a question. Well...
you want to make things, but these things have to live somewhere, somehow.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, it amazes me how many artists there are in the world. And every year there are more. And, you know, yeah, I think it's... I mean, I don't really know how to answer that. You know,
it's difficult.
People make what they make and the scale of them. And, you know, there was a time, certainly in my time as being an artist, where the scale of things has really multiplied. And, you know, people make enormous, great big sculptural installations. And, yeah, I don't know really what you do with them. I mean, hopefully some of them pack up into a few small boxes, but, you know, when you have enormous quantities of this work, yeah, it's really difficult to know what to do. And it's not like theatre where the props can go away and it just exists in a book, or, you know, with music, it's something where there's
this aura of the author.
Yes. So I really don't know, but hey, I'm not a curator, you are, so that's your problem.
So it's our problem. We have to answer to that. On this note, again, thank you so much, Rachel. I think thoroughly enjoyed listening to you, learning about your work, and I invite our audience now, the floor is yours. If you have any questions, just put your hand up, and I think someone is going around.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation and talk. I wanted to ask how much material goes into one of your sculptures? So, for example, that huge aluminium, that storage place that was arched, how much material would go into that?
Oh, it depends on how big the sculpture is. With something like House, we had to make a foundation within the house, and then we sprayed the house with concrete, and then we put in a metal structure, and then we sprayed that again. So I suppose the whole structure of the house, everything was like 20 centimeters thick. But it was all crushed down and put into the ground afterwards, so there was no problem with storage on that one.
I was wondering about the monument at the Judenplatz, because I walked by it many times in my everyday life living in Vienna, and I was always wondering how you came to the decision of turning around the books on the one hand, and if in your decision if you thought about the connotation of using books for commemorating the Holocaust and the problematic part of it, of associating Jews with intellectualism, and that also being a stereotype, if that was a thought that went into that. But I do appreciate the monument, I want to say.
Thank you. Well, I mean, the Jews are known as the people of the book, but I didn't, when I made that decision, it was very much about making it more sort of abstract, so that if you had the spine of a book, then it would be more likely that you would have some kind of explanation along the spine of what the book was. And I didn't want that. What I wanted was something that was much more abstract in its thinking. So it could be names of people, it could be Jewish literature, it could be any literature. It was really about trying to do something that was more kind of hidden.
Hello, Rachel. Thank you
Hi.
so much for your presentation. I just had a quick question about the Shotgun Shack. I'd like to know more about that sculpture, if you could talk about it.
Well, there are two of them. They are in the desert in Joshua Tree in the Mojave Desert, which is a very kind of brutal landscape. This was actually made by someone else, as was another piece that I made in Japan. Someone had bought this building and asked if I would be interested in getting them made, and I said absolutely, but I'm not coming and spending 6 months in the desert making it. So if we can find a way for you to do it. So this guy, he's called Jerry Sohn, started to make it, and he did this beautiful job, and he was so happy and enjoyed doing it so much that he then bought another one, and so we now have two there in the desert. There's another piece, just whilst we're talking about it. This one is called Kunisaki House, and it's made in Japan. And this was made during COVID, remarkably, where I was approached by this Japanese cultural institution to see if I would be interested working with the building out there. And from what I could tell from the building that they showed me, it was very dilapidated, very hard to understand what it was. And they did this incredible kind of presentation. I said, you need to do a survey. They made this filmic survey of it. And I gradually realized that inside the interior of this building that was all fallen down, there was an original beautiful Shinka house, a wooden house. And I said, okay, look, if we can repair the Shinka house and cast from that, I'd be delighted to do it. So that's what they did. And, you know, being Japanese, I knew that they would do a fantastic job. And they did this really beautiful job. We went there in September and had a look at it, and it's very touching when a community gets behind something like this, and they had a building next door, and they said, we want to turn this, this is in the middle of nowhere in southern Japan, and they said, we want to turn this building into a Rachel Whiteread study centre. And I said, well, that's very kind of you, but you really don't need a Rachel Whiteread study centre. What you probably need, like a lot of communities need, is somewhere that can be used as a community space, maybe as a tea room, and I can send you some books and you can have a little corner where you can see books of mine, but make it something that's yours, that belongs to the town. And which they did, and they made this, they ran a little architectural competition and made this beautiful building, which I think every month they have craft shows and exhibitions, and so it really, it feels like it's not just this building that's sort of commemorating this beautiful kind of way of life, but it's also helping to sort of regenerate the town. So they can be very good things.
Actually, this makes me think of something we were talking about. I know that sometimes you're asked about, so what is it that you would like to leave behind when you have all these shy sculptures scattered all over the world? And I remember you saying once that maybe some of these things will last, they will remain in full, in pieces, and maybe this is something that people would remember me for. So what is it that you think of as a gift that you can leave to the next generation of artists? Because, many people here think of you as a very, very instrumental and iconic figure that has left a big impact on their practice. And that's a lot of pressure on an artist, But at the same time, you talk sometimes about what do you leave to the next generation? What do they absorb from your work? What do you feel is something that you believe your work will leave for other artists to think about? Or
I think it's interesting, as you get older as an artist, to start thinking about your legacy, and not that I'm hoping to be around for a good few years yet, but and continue to make work. But these things, I think, making the shy sculptures, I certainly didn't have that in mind. It was more, wanting to make things with a presence, but that were in places that didn't necessarily have those access to those things, and to memorialize places that people maybe didn't think needed memorializing. So there was which is why they're called shy sculptures. There was a sort of shyness to them. There was a, hiding away. I hope, that these will stay around, and I think, gradually as the councils stop looking after them and the bits of paper disappear of who made it, and that for me doesn't really matter, but to have these sort of eerie places that people think, well, what was that? Every town has these strange places, don't they? Whether they're, a great big kind of sort of weird chimney in the center of a city, or,
So in a sense, this is already the archaeology of the future.
Yeah, well, indeed, yeah. And that's something that I have thought about, yeah. I'm a great fan of looking at, architecture that's sort of strange architecture that's left by the sea, or, and that it's been eroded, and, things that are used to stop, weather from eroding a river, or, these things that don't really, they're kind of architecture, but they're kind of non-architecture. By road structures, all those sorts of things which are kind of happenstance architecture.
I would like to ask something about the material plaster that you use and that you've used throughout your career. And you talked about Berlin as a humble city, shy structures. Also, plaster is a kind of humble material. So I was wondering, what is the joy for you to work with plaster, to pour plaster is the physicality of doing that. What do you like about plaster?
So I didn't entirely hear all of that question, but I do. With plaster. And there's something, the thing about plaster that I absolutely love as a material, and it never fails to kind of please me, is, you know, you start with the powder, you have some water, you put the powder in the water, you mix it up, it becomes warm, and then it becomes solid. And there's a sort of alchemy about this process, which is just a really pleasing thing to work with. And it, you know, I never, you know, I haven't actually worked with plaster for many years now, but it's not because I don't want to. It's just hasn't. I've just gone a certain way with my work, and you know, I felt like I haven't kind of needed to use it. But I also, you know, I love the way it picks up detail when you're making a mold. It's a very versatile and beautiful material. And historic, actually, yeah.
Of course, and when it dries and something goes wrong, you have to start all over again.
Yes, yeah. You have to always know what you're doing, and that's actually something that I think is quite interesting about the way I work. I always need to know what the result is going to be before I start. So I need to kind of complete the sculpture in my head before I finish it, because I'm always making molds, and the molds are the object. And so it has to be right before it's, you know.
Thank you for all the incredible insights that you have been sharing in this talk. Definitely a lot of food for thought. Something that I really want to take with me today is the concept of time and to heal from trauma, and in order to also make an artwork. And I am, in my work, I relate more with the digital space. And I was wondering if you had any time to reflect also around what it means time in the digital era and in the digital space.
Yeah, I mean, it's just not really my medium. I don't sort of, you know, I've never made a film, or, you know, I just don't, this is as close I get to using anything digital, is making slide presentations.
So no Instagram, no.
Oh, I know, I do have I have an Instagram account. Yes, I do, which I personally do. Yeah, but no, I'm not a great one for. You know, I have a lot of respect for it as a medium, but it's just not really what I do. Sorry.
You know, I think this is the great entry into doing something very digital. I'm going to ask you for something, Rachel. Do you mind if you and I stand together and I can take a selfie of you and I with everybody in the background? If that's okay for everyone. Would that be okay? Why don't we do this? We stand here.
Okay.
And then we can do this.
Age.
Because I think it's not often that we have so many amazing people. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us today. And just keep your eyes, just stay tuned for the next talk. We will be announcing the next artist very soon, the first Saturday in April. And again, for those of you who have not seen Rachel's work installed in the collection display, it's in the West Wing, I strongly recommend that you do so. Thank you. Thank you, Rachel.